She warned me I'd break her, but the truth was, I was already falling, and so was she. The first time I saw her, I didn't know what to make of the quiet weight she carried in the room. I was just stopping by my friend's house, another weekend, another casual visit, but the moment she appeared in the doorway, everything felt slightly off balance, in a way that was impossible to ignore. She was arranging flowers in a vase by the window, the morning light catching strands of silver in her chestnut hair. It wasn't just beauty. It was the kind of presence that fills a space without effort, the calm certainty of someone who had lived enough to know exactly who she was. I noticed the little details that day, the way she moved, deliberate yet effortless, the soft hum she made while arranging the flowers, almost as if the room itself had agreed to fall silent in her presence. When our eyes met, it was brief, almost accidental, a fleeting moment, but it sent an unfamiliar warmth crawling across my chest. There was an ease to her gaze, like she could see everything without judgment, and yet she kept a hint of distance that made me want to step closer. My friend introduced us with a casualness that made it feel ordinary, but my attention stayed on her. She smiled, just the corners of her lips, and it was enough to make my stomach tighten. I found myself noticing the warmth in her hands as she handed me a glass of water, the gentle weight of her fingers brushing against mine, the subtle perfume that lingered in the air long after she'd stepped away. Nothing overt, nothing designed to catch me, but everything about her felt deliberate in a way I couldn't name. I tried to focus on the small talk, on the mundane chatter about my friend's weekend plans, but my mind kept drifting back to the rhythm of her movements, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the soft quietness that filled the room when she simply existed in it. There was a quiet confidence there, tempered by something softer, almost fragile, that made me feel both drawn to her and careful around her. Even as I left that afternoon, the image of her lingered, the curve of her smile, the light brushing through her hair, the easy grace with which she carried herself. I didn't yet know her, didn't yet understand the quiet undercurrent of her life, but something had shifted in me. I was aware, perhaps for the first time, that someone older, someone so distinctly apart from my world, could hold my attention so completely without even trying. And in that realization, there was the first flicker of tension, a spark that was less about physical attraction and more about a strange, unspoken curiosity. A sense that beneath the surface of ordinary conversation, beneath the ease of her movements, there was a depth I wanted to understand. And, if I was honest, I wanted her to notice me noticing her. After that first afternoon, visits to my friend's house felt different. I found myself lingering, drawn not just to the familiar comfort of my friend's presence, but to the quiet energy she carried. The initial spark had grown into a gentle curiosity, the kind that made ordinary moments feel charged with possibility. It started small, almost imperceptibly. I offered to help carry groceries in from the car, fumbling slightly as she guided me, her hands brushing mine in the process. The touch was fleeting, innocent, yet I felt a warmth spread through me that I couldn't ignore. She laughed softly at my clumsiness, and there was no condescension in it, only a graceful patience that made me want to match her calm, careful pace. Later, we found ourselves in the kitchen, putting away the items. I reached for a jar at the same time she did, and our hands met briefly. Neither of us pulled away immediately. Instead, our fingers lingered, the faint pulse of contact sending a quiet ripple through the space between us. I caught her glance, subtle but intentional, and for a moment, I thought I could read the thought behind her eyes. Curiosity, amusement, maybe even a hint of something unspoken. The conversations grew longer, stretching beyond the perfunctory niceties. She spoke about her day with an ease that was both comforting and mesmerizing. There was a softness to her voice when she described memories or shared little frustrations, and I noticed how my posture unconsciously leaned closer, as if proximity could somehow translate into understanding. Her expressions shifted with each story, the faint arch of her brow, the delicate tilt of her lips, and I realized that I was memorizing them, not intentionally, but because every detail seemed quietly significant. It wasn't all verbal. Sometimes, it was the shared silences that lingered the longest. I remember sitting across from her at the kitchen table one evening, the sun casting golden light across her face, and realizing that the room could be full of quiet without feeling empty. She reached for a napkin, and our hands brushed again. So light it could have been accidental, yet there was a tension there, an unspoken acknowledgement of presence. My chest tightened slightly, not with desire exactly, but with the intensity of awareness. Even small gestures carried weight. The way she adjusted a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the faint scent of her perfume as she moved around the room, the subtle warmth of her smile when she caught my eye across the table, they all layered together, creating a sense of intimacy that had nothing to do with words. And yet, beneath the surface, I could sense something deeper, a quiet electricity that neither of us dared to name. By the end of the visit, I realized that our connection had shifted. It was no longer simply about being polite or passing the time. It had become a careful dance, a slow recognition of each other's presence. And as I left, carrying the memory of the warmth, the soft laughter, the fleeting touches, I understood that these small, shared moments, was the beginning of something neither of us could quite define, yet both of us already felt. The subtle connection we'd built over the past few visits began to take on a weight I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. There were no overt confessions, no bold gestures, but something in the quiet spaces between us shifted. Every glance, every pause in conversation, carried meaning that neither of us dared to fully acknowledge. It happened one evening while I was helping her in the living room, organizing old photo albums my friend had carelessly left stacked on a shelf. She leaned over to reach the top shelf, and I caught a glimpse of the curve of her neck, the faint line of tension in her shoulder. Our hands brushed as I handed her a photo frame, and this time, the touch lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. I noticed the way her gaze met mine, slightly startled, but soft, curious, perhaps, at the awareness I carried for her. Later, we sat together on the couch, flipping through the albums. She began sharing memories, her voice dropping into a quieter tone as she described moments that were clearly tender or painful. I felt the pull of her vulnerability, the way her eyes glistened ever so slightly when she recounted a bittersweet story from her past. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but I hesitated, aware of the unspoken boundary that hovered between us. Instead, I let my presence speak for me, leaning slightly closer, letting the warmth of proximity bridge the words I couldn't voice. It was in these moments that the tension became tangible. A pause would stretch too long, a glance would catch the corner of the eye, and suddenly I was hyper-aware of every breath, every subtle movement. When she laughed softly at something my friend said offhandedly, I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed, the tiny tilt of her head that invited my attention. I wanted to remark on it, to tell her that I saw her, not just in passing, but truly, and yet the words never formed. Even mundane actions took on weight. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and I found my fingers itching to do the same for her, to close the tiny gap between us. When she shifted on the couch to reach for a blanket, the warmth of her side pressed momentarily against mine, and it felt both innocent and charged. My heart thumped with the awareness that every movement, however ordinary, was now laden with unspoken meaning. By the end of the evening, I realized that this tension wasn't something fleeting. It was building quietly, steadily, like a current running just beneath the surface. We didn't speak about it, nor did we need to. The pause in her laughter, the fleeting glances, the faint brush of hands across the armrest, they said everything we weren't yet ready to say aloud. And in the quiet that followed our goodbye, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and restraint. I was drawn to her in a way that went beyond admiration, yet I was painfully aware of the boundaries we couldn't cross, the world outside this small room that would never understand. Still, even with that hesitation, I knew that the unspoken tension, the electricity of glances and pauses, was the first real step toward something far more intimate, something neither of us could ignore for long. The tension between us had grown so quietly, so deliberately, that by the time it surfaced, it felt inevitable, almost fragile, like glass teetering on the edge of a table. That evening, I had stayed later than usual, ostensibly helping my friend with a small home project, but in truth, it was an excuse. I found myself drawn to her presence, to the calm, steady way she moved through the room, and to the way her eyes occasionally flicked toward me, filled with unspoken questions and something softer, something closer to longing. She was arranging books on the shelf, and I was handing them to her one by one. Our fingers brushed repeatedly, the contact lingering just long enough to send an unmistakable spark up my arm. I tried to focus on the task, on the mundane rhythm of placing the books, but the awareness of her proximity made every action deliberate, every movement weighted with possibility. Her shoulder occasionally nudged mine, just slightly, a silent acknowledgement of our closeness. And then it happened, the moment that shifted everything. She paused mid-motion, tilting her head slightly, and her voice dropped to a whisper, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "You'll break me." The words were light, but they carried the weight of vulnerability, of unspoken trust. My chest tightened. I froze, unsure whether to respond immediately, caught in the sudden intimacy of the moment. She wasn't accusing, wasn't playful exactly. There was a tenderness, a confession in the way she let the words linger in the space between us. For a heartbeat, I simply looked at her, trying to gauge the full meaning behind the whisper. Her eyes met mine, steady and searching, and I felt a rush of understanding. This wasn't just a fleeting comment. It was an admission of fear and desire intertwined. Her hand, resting lightly on the shelf, trembled slightly, and I realized how much courage it must have taken to voice even that small fragment of her vulnerability. I felt compelled to answer, not with words that could overstep, but with the truth that resonated within me. I leaned slightly closer, careful not to invade her space, and let my voice drop just enough for only her to hear. "Only until you beg for more," I said, not as a challenge, but as a promise, a reflection of the careful balance between restraint and desire that had been building between us. The words hovered in the air, heavy with tension, yet laced with warmth. She didn't respond immediately, and I wasn't sure if I wanted her to. Instead, she gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile, a flicker of acknowledgement, a silent agreement that this connection, fragile and forbidden as it might be, existed. I felt the tension in my chest ease just slightly, replaced by a quiet exhilaration. That whisper, that delicate confession, had crystallized the invisible thread that had been binding us for weeks. Even as the evening ended, and I prepared to leave, I carried the memory of that whisper with me. It wasn't a declaration of romance, not yet, but it was the first true acknowledgement of what lingered beneath our ordinary gestures. A pull that neither of us could ignore, a spark of emotional intimacy that promised something far more profound, if only we were patient enough to see it unfold. After that whispered confession, the air between us changed in ways I couldn't immediately define. It wasn't a dramatic shift. Nothing about her altered outwardly. She still moved through the house with her effortless grace, her smile still soft and warm. Yet beneath the surface, a current had begun to flow, a quiet, steady pull that made ordinary moments feel heavier with meaning. Every shared glance, every brush of hands, now carried a resonance I could no longer ignore. I found myself seeking her out in the small routines of the day. When I helped her carry groceries, I lingered a little longer than necessary, our hands brushing again in a casual, almost accidental way. The warmth of her skin against mine was electric yet comforting, a paradox that left me both excited and cautious. She noticed these moments too, slight shifts in the tilt of her head, the way her eyes met mine just a heartbeat longer than usual, a softening of her posture when she lingered near me. Each of these small gestures became a conversation without words, a dialogue of proximity and attention that neither of us needed to speak aloud. Even shared silences began to take on weight. Sitting side by side on the couch while my friend busied himself elsewhere, we'd sometimes find ourselves looking at the same object, a photograph, a book, and our hands would brush, the faint pulse of contact sending ripples through my chest. I began to notice the subtle way she made space for me. The way she would adjust her chair slightly so our knees were nearly touching. The way her shoulder would graze mine when she reached across the table. It was intimate, yet entirely innocent, charged with an unspoken understanding that something deeper existed between us. The emotional closeness was as much in the words as in the silences. She would share small frustrations, the quiet stresses of her day, and I would listen, not just to respond, but to absorb, to be present. And in turn, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't with anyone my age, sharing thoughts, uncertainties, hopes I usually kept tucked away. Her presence demanded honesty, and in that honesty, a trust was forming, delicate but undeniably strong. The subtle tension between us had evolved into something richer, longing tempered by respect, desire moderated by awareness. I found myself studying her in quiet moments, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the gentle tilt of her head when she was thinking, the way she unconsciously leaned closer in conversation. And with each observation, I realized that the pull wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a draw toward a shared intimacy that had been carefully cultivated over time. By the time I left that evening, I felt the weight of what had begun to grow between us. It was no longer fleeting curiosity or fascination. It was a slow-burn realization that we had entered a space neither of us fully controlled. Every lingering touch, every shared glance, every quiet exchange had built a delicate intimacy that was both thrilling and terrifying. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, I carried with me a profound understanding. This was no longer just admiration. It was the beginning of something far deeper, something that demanded patience, care, and the courage to feel it fully. The tension that had been quietly building over weeks reached a point I could no longer ignore. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It wasn't a confession shouted across a room. But it was a moment thick with vulnerability, where everything we had been dancing around finally demanded acknowledgement. We were sitting together in the living room late one evening. The day had faded into a soft twilight, the room bathed in the warm, golden glow of the lamps. Outside, the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of trees created a gentle backdrop, almost as if the world itself had softened to give us this space. She sat across from me, a book in her lap, but her eyes weren't on the pages. They were on me, steady and searching, the quiet intensity of her gaze making it impossible to focus elsewhere. I felt the weight of it, the pull of something unspoken that had grown heavier with each shared glance, each lingering touch. I wanted to bridge the gap between us, to close the small distance, but I hesitated, acutely aware of the line we hadn't yet crossed. And then, in the quiet, she spoke, not about feelings, not directly, but about fear. "I don't want to get hurt," she said softly, almost whispering. Her voice carried a fragility that struck me more than any dramatic declaration could have. It wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation, a subtle admission of trust. I leaned a little closer, careful not to overstep, my heart thudding in rhythm with the vulnerability she had laid bare. "I know," I murmured, my voice low enough for only her to hear. "I don't want to hurt you either. But I can't ignore this." My words trembled slightly, not from uncertainty about my feelings, but from the gravity of acknowledging them aloud. There it was, the unspoken, the attraction, the longing, the complicated awareness of boundaries that neither of us could ignore. We sat like that for a long moment, the silence stretching between us. And in that silence, our closeness became almost tangible. I noticed the subtle warmth of her hand resting on the arm of the couch, the faint brush of her hair against her cheek, the steady pulse of her presence beside me. Every detail was amplified by the tension in the room, and I realized that the emotional intimacy we had been cultivating had reached its peak, raw, undeniable, and entirely mutual. Finally, she shifted slightly, leaning a little closer, just enough that our shoulders brushed. Her eyes met mine again, soft but unflinching. "I'm scared," she admitted. Not of me, not really, but of what we were feeling, of how deeply she had let herself care. I reached for her hand, letting my fingers rest lightly over hers. The contact was simple, grounding, yet it carried the full weight of everything we hadn't said. And in that quiet connection, in the brush of fingers and the meeting of eyes, something shifted. The tension, the hesitation, the unspoken longing, all of it became a shared understanding. We didn't need to rush, didn't need to define it fully yet. But for the first time, we acknowledged that what existed between us was real, delicate, and profoundly intimate. And in that acknowledgement, the slow burn of our connection reached its emotional climax, leaving us suspended in a moment of fragile, beautiful possibility. The tension that had defined our connection for weeks finally softened into something quietly, undeniably warm. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, nor a confessional climax. It was subtler than that, a slow, steady unfolding that filled the spaces between us with a sense of safety and closeness I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. That evening, we found ourselves alone after dinner, the rest of the house quiet. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the floorboards under our weight were the only sounds, yet they seemed to amplify the rhythm of our presence together. We sat side by side on the couch, not touching at first, but aware of each other in a way that made every subtle shift, her hand brushing against the cushion, the tilt of her shoulder, the slight bend of her knee, meaningful. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, a calm steadiness that contrasted with the quickening of my own heartbeat. We exchanged small smiles, the kind that lingered just long enough to carry the weight of unspoken understanding. Eventually, the space between us closed in the most natural way. She reached for a blanket, and our hands brushed, this time lingering deliberately. I let my fingers rest over hers, feeling the soft warmth of her skin, the steady pulse beneath. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled around mine slightly, a quiet acceptance that spoke louder than any words could. It was a gesture of trust, of acknowledgement, of intimacy without urgency. We spoke in low tones, our conversation meandering from small, mundane details to reflections on the quiet moments we'd shared. I noticed the way she leaned closer when she laughed, the subtle tilt of her head when she was listening intently, the softness in her eyes when they met mine. Every gesture, every glance, carried a tenderness that made the outside world fade away, leaving only the two of us in that shared space. At one point, I gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, tucking it behind her ear. She leaned into the touch, resting her head lightly against my shoulder, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat against my chest. It was a moment of pure, YouTube-safe intimacy, safe, profound, and entirely satisfying. The slow burn of our connection had finally matured into a warmth that was both physical and emotional, a gentle affirmation of what we had been building together. By the time I left that evening, there was a sense of completion, of balance. The tension had softened, replaced by a steady intimacy that promised continuity rather than fleeting excitement. I realized that this connection, this age gap, quietly forbidden, beautifully delicate bond, wasn't about drama or urgency. It was about presence, trust, and the shared rhythm of two people finding comfort and desire in one another without needing to rush. And as I stepped out into the night, the memory of her warmth, her subtle smiles, the gentle brush of her hand, lingered with me. It was a promise not of immediate passion, but of something enduring, a slow-burn romance that had reached its emotional fulfillment, leaving us connected, content, and quietly, beautifully close.